Welcome to this ATA Insights webinar. Thank you for your ongoing interest and support of our webinar programs. Today's session will begin in 2 minutes. ATA Insights Webinars is an online platform for the dissemination of professional renewable energy knowledge across international borders. Our aim is to democratize access to information, for innovation to spread faster, and to make the industry more competitive. And we do this through our online sessions, open to all our members. Every year we do more than 100 sessions with over 250 speakers, 50,000 attendees from more than 50 countries. To participate in the session today, use the chat on the right-hand side to introduce yourself, your company, and where you're joining from. Under the screen you will find the Q&A box, where you can send your questions for the speakers. We will get to as many as we can today. We're recording this session and we will send you a link to the materials in a few days. Please consider supporting our content creation for the webinar program. Contact us on the email on screen.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're joining from today. This is Belén Gallego. I am the CEO of ATA Insights and I'm joining from Spain. Therefore, it's really early here. And we have with us today three experts that are going to be talking about the green hydrogen exporting opportunity of Australia. And each of them is set in a different place. So please, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, starting with Rachel, please. And if you could also tell us where you are today so that we can see how we are.
Great, thanks, Belén. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm usually based in DC, but currently based in Lebanon, given the pandemic. So it's currently 7 a.m. here. So whoever is up early, I feel you. Thank you all for joining. I'm Rachel Fakhri. I'm a senior policy analyst for the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are a nonprofit based in New York. We have several offices across the US, with some offices in India, China, and Latin America. I work on many different things, including analyzing how the US can achieve its deep decarbonization targets, and recently been doing a lot of work on hydrogen. So really excited to be here and take your questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rachel. Now I'd like to ask Daniel to do the same. Please introduce yourself, tell us where you're based, and tell us a little bit about what you do. Thank you. And don't forget to unmute your microphone.
Thanks, Belén. I'm Daniel from Melbourne in Australia. I'm the founder and director of Acacia Sustainability, and we work with world-leading utility-scale renewable technologies and technologies that enable renewable energy. For example, Bryn Miller Energy, they do thermal storage. We're working with them trying to bring them to Australia. We also offer research services, so do some work with World Wildlife Fund, for example, and I'll be sharing some of their insights that I've been helping them with into renewable hydrogen today. And in the next week or so, I'm likely to launch a new sustainable travel website, which I put off thanks to the pandemic.
We're going to need the advice you can give us.
Yeah.
after what's going on to actually travel around. Okay, and last but sorry?
Domestic travel first.
Oh, okay, fair enough. That makes sense. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Robert to do the same. Introduce yourself, where you're based from on today, and what about what you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and look, thank you for the opportunity to ATA Insights to present today. I've joined lots of webinars previously, certainly learned a lot about sort of renewables and solar thermal in Spain. So quite happy to be sort of contributing and participating and giving back. My name's Robert. I'm based in Perth, Western Australia, on the west coast, the sunny side of the country. I work for GHD. GHD is an international sort of technical services provider or a consultant. We are very active in the hydrogen sector globally. We work very closely with clients. We work very closely with governments as well in informing policy, informing clients on projects and things like that. My role within the business is, I guess, service line leader or technical director for all things power. Now, I'm not a hydrogen sort of background person, but you'll be amazed, especially in the hydrogen sector in Australia, when you say the word hydrogen, very likely you're talking about a hydrogen facility paired with wind or solar. And in the context of today's topic, green hydrogen, this is exactly sort of the areas I hope to give a bit of insights on. But yeah, thank you again for the opportunity, and so look forward to engaging with everybody here on this platform today.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, Rachel, and Daniel. And we're going to do the following today. It's going to be a very simple structure. First, Rachel is going to present, then Daniel, then Robert, then we'll take questions. And there is certainly a lot to discuss. There is so much to be done on renewable hydrogen. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about hydrogen forever, and yet, you know, we've only recently kind of woken up to the opportunity of what it really takes, because the basics of hydrogen is a scale, and it's not something that we could master, you know, before this. We're going to talk about pricing, markets, and also opportunities. So please, Rachel, if you could prepare your screen. Actually, I think Marina's preparing your screen. And here we go. And then, yeah, let's do your presentation. And for those people who are on the audience, I'd like to ask, please, very simple. We're recording. We will send you the link to the materials and to the recordings. Also, please, if you could send your questions by the Q&A box and introduce yourself through the chat. But Q&A box is at the bottom, and we'll take the questions through there. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Rachel.
Great. Thank you, Belen. Appreciate it. Again, thank you, ATA Insights, for having me today to speak about this burgeoning and exciting topic. So next slide, please, Marina. Great. So the way I structured this presentation today is kind of divided into two parts. The first part will mostly focus on projections related to green hydrogen, kind of market movements, etc. And then the second will focus more on the international export prospects, which of course are an important topic for today's discussion. Next slide, please. Great. So before we get started and talk about green hydrogen, I think it's worth briefly mentioning what the landscape for hydrogen looks like today. So this graph is pulled from the International Energy Agency and kind of reflects the current lay of the land of hydrogen. The industry worldwide is not small. It is mostly used in refining to remove sulfur impurities from oil. It's also the main component in fertilizer production. However, it's mostly produced from natural gas, coal, and some oil, so it's mostly fossil fuels. That said, the production of hydrogen can be cleaned up to produce what we call green hydrogen. The way it works is wind and solar electricity could be used to split water into its components of hydrogen and oxygen in what we call an electrolyzer. Currently, green hydrogen only makes up less than or about 1% of global hydrogen production. Next slide, please, actually, Marina. Thank you. And that is because it is still much more expensive than fossil-based hydrogen. Next slide, please. However, as Belen alluded to, we've been talking about this for a very long time. So why is all of a sudden, why has this become such an important topic in the past year and a half or so? It is due to two main elements or developments. The first one relates to the drop in renewable energy costs. Wind and solar costs have plummeted in the past 10 years by about 40% to 80% respectively. And considering that renewable costs are the main driver of green hydrogen costs, this significant reduction in renewable costs has completely changed the economics of producing green hydrogen and is creating an opportunity to produce quite cheap renewable hydrogen. Excuse me. The second main development relates to what is happening on the deep decarbonization side. As many of you may know, the IPCC in their latest report directed the world to achieve a net zero greenhouse gas economy by 2050, which means that countries would need to achieve a net zero emissions economy by mid-century, which has pushed many countries across the world to set net zero targets by 2050, which means that they would need to decarbonize all of their sectors, including the hardest ones like aviation, long distance trucking, maritime shipping, and heavy industry, like cement and steel. And it just so happens that hydrogen can be a clean option to replace fossil fuels in all of these different uses. So it's kind of a jack of all trades. And both of those elements together have created this significant, excuse me, it's really early in the morning, has created this very significant interest in green hydrogen across the world. Next slide, please. So this is a schematic pulled from the Carbon Brief that sort of illustrates a hydrogen economy. This is what many hydrogen advocates envision by mid-century to have kind of an economy where hydrogen plays a much bigger role than it does today. The way it works is it would be produced from different low carbon sources. It could be renewable energy, it could be nuclear, it could be carbon capture and storage associated with fossil production, and then could be used across different sectors. It could be used to produce electricity, could be used in heavy industry, in aviation, in trucking, and it could be also exported to countries that don't have a good hydrogen resource. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of how big of a role it can play by 2050, this is a graph that pulls together different estimates from different sources of the share of our energy needs that hydrogen can meet by mid-century. As you can see, they vary significantly from one another, and this, this is not unexpected considering this is still a very nascent space. Bloomberg, which is the bottom, BNEF are the most optimistic. Bloomberg projects that hydrogen could meet as much as a quarter of our energy needs by mid-century. Not all experts agree it's going to play as big of a role, but there is broad consensus that it's going to play, if not a huge role, at least a very critical and important role. Next slide, please. So this map pretty much illustrates where most of the activity and the interest is happening internationally. It shows where or which countries have passed some sort of a hydrogen strategy or roadmap, which countries are starting to do so or preparing that, and which countries are showing interest in technology. So as you can see in dark blue, the countries that have passed or implemented some sort of a roadmap includes Australia, Japan, South Korea, Western Europe, Russia, Chile, with China, Morocco, and the Middle East working on their own strategies, which should be quite exciting to see. And the World Energy Council projects that in the next 4 years, the countries that would have some sort of hydrogen strategy would represent over 80% of global GDP. So this gives you a sense of just how relevant this is starting to become and will become in the next 4 years. Next slide, please. And this interest is starting to materialize in the announced projects. This graph reflects the electrolyzer projects that have been announced through 2025. As you can see, the project pipeline for the next 5 years is more than 30 times larger, the cumulative electrolyzer capacity of the past 20 years. In fact, things are moving so fast that Wood Mackenzie, the company that collects this data, had to update its projections or its pipeline twice within 5 months because it doubled. So this gives you a sense just of how fast things are moving and how quick development is happening. Next slide, please. This map is meant to give you more of a geographical sense of where much of the activity is happening. It shows where the low carbon hydrogen projects are being announced. As you can see, Australia, Western Europe leads. I believe Australia leads on green. There is much more kind of blue hydrogen projects in Western Europe, and this is gas plus CCS. I think Saudi Arabia should be a bigger dot. This map was produced before the latest announcements by Saudi to invest in a very, very large green hydrogen project. So it would be the third leader alongside Australia and Western Europe. Next slide, please. I did not want to talk about green hydrogen and kind of this past year without mentioning the EU Commission's strategy, because it is, I would say, the most relevant of the past year and could potentially be a game changer. The EU calls or is planning on spending nearly $500 billion kind of funneling this money into green hydrogen by mid-century, and also has, importantly, a very, very large deployment target of electrolyzer by 2030. Bloomberg has estimated, or at least contextualized, how big this target is by comparing it to its own previous optimistic deployment scale for electrolyzers. And as you can see, the EU target sizably exceeds Bloomberg's most optimistic assumptions. So this gives you a sense of, the sense of scale that we could potentially see in the next 10 years. And this is projected to significantly drive costs down. So next slide, please. Electrolyzer costs are projected to plummet in the next decades, thanks to all of these commitments that we're seeing, thanks to economies of scale and learning and whatnot. Next slide, please. And by extension, considering that electrolyzer costs are projected to drop, considering that renewable costs are projected to keep on dropping, green hydrogen costs are projected to drop significantly. So this graph compares costs of different low carbon forms of hydrogen in Australia. Most of those are based, based on Bloomberg estimates. As you can see, green hydrogen costs are projected to plummet. That's in green. It's projected to be the cheapest form of low carbon hydrogen in Australia by 2030. And Bloomberg projects it's going to be even cheaper than today's gas hydrogen in Australia. This is more on the optimistic side. However, considering the recent developments, there is reason to believe this could materialize. Next slide, please. Great, so moving on to the kind of international trade angle. Green hydrogen has a pretty good potential to be internationally traded, considering that renewable costs and availability are the main cost drivers, and those differ significantly by region, of course. So this map is from Bloomberg. It shows the different costs of hydrogen across countries, of green hydrogen in particular, in both 2030 and 2050. So if you look at 2050, the lighter, the cheaper, you can see that Australia, India, Scandinavia, Chile, the US have the cheapest, and that is thanks to their plentiful and cheap renewable resource. Australia and Saudi have already committed to export green hydrogen to different countries. Morocco and Chile are starting to put themselves on the map as potential exporters, but have not committed to anything just yet. These are the red stars. The purple stars reflect two potential exporters. The US could emerge as one. With the Biden administration, we project there could be some significant changes on the hydrogen front. And Russia could also become an important exporter, maybe of not green hydrogen, of blue hydrogen, considering its plentiful gas resource. We expect it would want to kind of maintain its geopolitical influence as an energy exporter. In terms of importers, it's still hard to see. This is still all very nascent, but Western Europe, Japan, and South Korea have, of course, currently shown their interest in becoming important importers of hydrogen. Next slide, please. Great. So I know that Robert and Daniel are going to speak more to this, but as you know, Australia is gearing up to become a major electrostate and a major exporter of hydrogen. The Asian Renewable Energy Hub is the most ambitious low-carbon hydrogen project to date. And it's really well positioned to become this large exporter. It has a great renewable resource. It has a great track record in building large-scale energy industries, and a strong reputation as a proven trade partner to Asia's biggest energy importers. It has very strong trade potential with Japan and South Korea, and it's already signed some statements and agreements with those two countries. And this map just gives you a sense of where the strongest renewable hydrogen potential is. As you can see, it's focused or localized mostly on the outer edge, closer to the water. Next slide, please. However, in terms of the opportunity to expand and become a global exporter, this is still, I would say, a question mark, because Australia is, of course, remote geographically from the rest of the world, which means that most of its hydrogen exports would need to be seaborne via maritime shipping. And this is quite costly because hydrogen would need to be converted to either ammonia or liquid form to be able to be transported via ships. And this comes with quite a bit of efficiency losses from all the conversion and reconversion steps, and it would come also at some hefty infrastructure costs. So to give you a sense of what those costs would look like, this graph pulls data from Bloomberg and estimates costs to export hydrogen from Australia to Japan and Australia to India. As you can see, the transport costs in blue is really quite hefty. And Bloomberg estimates that the cost difference between countries to produce hydrogen is unlikely to be large enough to justify such a big premium for transport. Next slide, please. Instead, the closer kind of pipeline reachable geographies offer the bigger opportunity because pipelines are much cheaper. Pipelines can transport hydrogen in gas form, so there are no efficiency losses or conversion steps. And this graph also pulls data from Bloomberg and compares the cost of transporting hydrogen via via maritime shipping versus via pipeline. Bloomberg estimates that pipeline costs are well within the variance of potential hydrogen production between countries, and thereby maybe pipeline imports may become a common feature of any future hydrogen economy. So basically the conclusion is that maritime imports may make economic sense when a country either cannot physically produce its renewable energy because of some land use constraints and cannot obtain secure access via pipelines. That's why Japan and Korea offer such big opportunities, because they don't have the land to produce their renewables and they don't have great relations with their neighboring countries, so cannot have easy pipeline access. Next slide, please. So to conclude, there is really strong momentum and support for green hydrogen, and for good reason. We expect some significant cost reductions to occur in the next 10 years, thanks to all the commitments that we're seeing and the flurry of announced projects. There's also great potential for hydrogen to become internationally traded, considering the difference in renewable resource and cost across the countries. And there's very strong potential for Australia to become a large regional hydrogen exporter. However, the economics point to pipeline-based imports to be more feasible and cheaper. Some hydrogen advocates like to call it the new oil, considering its potential to be traded. However, while oil is very localized and would require, some really long distance shipping and whatnot, hydrogen is much more widespread. Essentially can be produced wherever there is renewable energy. So basically it can be traded at much shorter distances, which means that Australia's pool of trading partners may be more limited to Japan, Korea, and possibly a few Southeast Asian countries. So basically, while Australia can become a regional powerhouse, it seems wiser to go for a more modular investment in export infrastructure as opposed to bulk investments really early on, under the assumption that there would be some global trade prospect, and focus on developing the domestic market, considering all the uncertainties. Next slide, please. Here are some useful resources for folks who are interested. And that is it for me. Looking forward to field some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think that is as condensed and informative presentation about the status of green hydrogen in the world as one can get. So thank you very much for that. It's certainly very, very informative and takes into consideration a lot of things. Next, I'd like to ask Daniel to please share your screen and prepare your presentation. And as I said earlier, we do the questions thereafter. I have a bunch of them already stored up for you guys because this is a very interesting topic to us right now. Right, Daniel? We can see your screen perfectly.
Excellent.
And
Thanks,
we can hear you. Perfect. Let's go for it.
Fantastic. Yes, so as I mentioned before, I'm Daniel from Acacia Sustainability. In this presentation, I'll be discussing a few findings that I put together for WWF Australia when they put together their hydrogen position paper. And I highly recommend having a read of that because it goes into the opportunity in Australia in more detail. Rachel did a great job summarizing everything, and she'll touch on a few points but she touched on a few points that I'm going to mention. So why Australia? There's actually a great opportunity for negative emissions through our exports. Australia, we've got a huge land mass and some of the world's best solar and wind resources, which creates a very significant opportunity to produce renewable energy at scale and a very low cost compared to some of the competing economies, which Rachel showed some numbers on before. Yeah, this low-cost renewable energy can be used to produce renewable hydrogen that could be used in pipelines, which was also discussed. It could be used to produce green ammonia, renewable fuels that can be used for transport, including aviation and marine sectors, but also to produce green steel and aluminium. And that's something else that's really interesting, because we in Australia have such a large iron ore resource that we currently export. We don't really produce much iron in the country, but there's the opportunity to decarbonize the steel sector and export embodied renewable energy in steel. So that's a really interesting opportunity for Australia. And also we rank very highly on the World Bank's ease of doing business, and we're a trusted, stable democracy with highly skilled workforce, and we already have well-established trading relationships. Interestingly, in the most recent budgets that were put out federally and by all the states, so the 2020-2021 budgets, there was quite a bit of funding allocated towards hydrogen, and in particular renewable hydrogen, both projects and for different funds and different strategies. And ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, was also topped up with a baseline funding of $1.43 billion over the next 10 years, some of which will be awarded to hydrogen projects over the 10 years. So all the states and territories are moving forward. They're all switched on. They're well aware of hydrogen, and they're all moving forward. And yeah, if you download my slides after the talk, you'll be able to click the link and be able to get access to all of the hydrogen strategies that both the federal government and all the states and territories have either put out or are about to put out. So that shows you just how serious Australia is taking hydrogen, and most states, if not all states, renewable hydrogen, where the federal government is taking a more technological neutral approach. So what's driving renewable hydrogen is the push to zero emissions. We've seen some amazing commitments in the last 12 months in particular, very significant commitments from nations, states, and companies. And to put in perspective what's happening, companies with a combined revenue of $11.4 trillion, equivalent to half of the US GDP, are pursuing zero emissions. It's incredible what's happening. It's really fantastic work, and it's all about collaboration. And this bodes well for the Australian renewable energy exports that will come from our incredible resource here. So yeah, we'll have the ability to produce renewable hydrogen at low cost that can be used to decarbonize the difficult sectors to abate, like agriculture, so ammonia, metals that I spoke about before. So there's strong push globally for net zero, which is really fantastic to see. The key export markets for Australia, obviously we're located in Asia, so we've got incredible trading partners already. So the export opportunities include Japan, South Korea, Singapore. In particular, these countries don't necessarily have such good renewable resources that we do. In particular, Singapore is a very small country, so we've got the opportunity to export both embodied renewable energy, direct electricity through undersea cables. There's some interesting projects there, but also hydrogen in the form of ammonia, or even pipelines, as was mentioned before. The Australian government also just signed an agreement to explore the feasibility of developing a hydrogen supply chain with Germany. So keen to see how that unfolds. But then there's also the emerging opportunities that I mentioned before, for example, embodied renewable energy in things like green steel. So there's opportunity to open new markets beyond Asia that might seem logical. And here I've just listed a few of the key Australian hydrogen export projects that are going ahead that I'm pretty sure Robert will go into more detail in terms of the WA projects. But yeah, some really big projects. So the Origin Energy and Fortescue metals projects that were just announced as idea projects that are likely to go ahead in Tasmania. Tasmania has just reached 100% renewable energy. So they're already powered by renewables, predominantly by their significant hydro resources. So they're a perfect starting point for renewable hydrogen. And yeah, some quite large projects, but then yeah, the CWP and Yarra and NG projects, very large. Excited to hear what Robert has to say about those. So essentially there's significant opportunities for investment in Australia across multiple supply chains. As mentioned, there's a range of different areas that you can use hydrogen, renewable hydrogen. So you can use it as chemical feedstocks in metals, mining, cement, in the transport sector, for storage, for remote communities to balance microgrids, for example. And then there's the other export use cases where it could be shipped directly to countries like Singapore that don't have their own resources. So across all of these areas, their supply chains can be explored. So if you're developing new technologies in pipelines or transmission networks, solar, different areas to improve efficiencies in large scale solar, because you need a lot of solar and wind power to produce this hydrogen at scale. Huge opportunities in Australia over the coming years. With that, I just wanted to mention, so should be focusing on green assets, not stranded assets. So I'd like to push for green hydrogen rather than blue or gray, because we should be planning for the future, because that's where you're going to spend the rest of your life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very good points raised in there. And I love the quote from Mark Twain. He's right, correct. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask Robert now to share your presentation and unmute your microphone and prepare. And I have a few questions lined up for you guys, but also the people in the audience, please send us the questions that you have through the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to those as soon as the presentations are over. And we're recording, so we'll send you the materials that I think will be very much appreciated by everyone, especially the people who maybe couldn't make it because of the time. Robert, do you need any help to share your screen? Oh, here we go. Perfect.
Can you see it? Is it there? It's the presentation.
We can, however, we can still see like the two boxes, like one large and one small. So if you go to display settings at the top, the second menu on the top.
Yep.
Press in there. And just go to duplicate slideshow. I think that's the right one. I always get them wrong, to be honest, but hopefully.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Is that better?
For now, I don't know about my fellow, maybe you guys can, oh, now we can see. Yes, perfect. Go for it.
Fantastic. All right, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, first time doing it this way.
It happens.
So I'm glad we sorted it out. Look, always easy to go last, yeah? And I think sort of Rachel and Daniel covered off a lot of the sort of contextual things. So maybe I won't dwell on them too much as I go through my slides and concentrate more, I think, on the local Western Australian perspective. But look, I guess sort of, talking points really around the government initiatives, I guess what our comparative advantages are here in Australia. And then I think I'll spend some more time talking about the projects and developments that we've observed and things that we're seeing, and I'll put some insights there. So I'll be quick here. So yeah, look, GHD, I think I said in the opening, sort of, we're a technical services, consultancy. So scientists, advisors, engineers, we're energy experts. We've got presence all around the world, UK, Australia, New Zealand, North America, Philippines, Singapore. Energy and resources is the sector that I work in and we concentrate on when it comes to hydrogen, but we do everything else, I suppose, as well: water, transportation, and hydrogen does cross over in some of these sectors. When it comes to hydrogen at the moment, and our sort of play in the market sector, we call our initiative Future Energy. This is sort of, we recognise that we need to decarbonise and there's an energy transition going on. So, we're active in a lot of those market areas, but hydrogen is an important one, and it certainly crosses over a number of sectors, which we might touch on as I go through some of these future slides as well. Okay, so market potential export from WA. The role of hydrogen here, and I think we've touched on it again through Rachel and Daniel. There's energy security aspects here when it comes to hydrogen. Certainly, all the reports that have been published recently by the International Energy Authority, talk about hydrogen, as being, the sort of, the next big thing, in terms of transport decarbonisation, in terms of industrial manufacturing decarbonisation, decarbonising energy and electricity networks as well. Obviously replacing fossil fuels as well with hydrogen. Huge potential there to reduce greenhouse gases. So there's lots of reports out in the public domain on this. Plenty to read there, I suppose. Hydrogen reduction, look, I'll be quick on this. I think just want to make the distinction, I think the other speakers made as well, in terms of green and blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen, it's called blue obviously because we're still relying on fossil fuels to create it, and processes that are well established to create hydrogen from fossil fuels. But the green hydrogen, and when we talk green hydrogen, we talk about really sort of wind, sun, hydro, those sort of energy sources to create green hydrogen through electrolysis, and then using all the other, hydrogen being used in all the sort of downstream market opportunities, transport, industrial, properties. I can't see the last slide. Power generation storage, sorry. So that's that, won't dwell on that. Okay, so Australian government initiatives, and I know we touched on this, so I think it was an outline, Daniel, I think you had it on yours, but there are various initiatives, and I think it all started back sort of, two and a half years ago now with our national hydrogen strategy, led by Dr. Finkel. And that, I guess, was the sort of, the sort of catapult and catalyst to sort of start, heading down our sort of, energy transition, low carbon energy transition with hydrogen in mind. ARENA, I'm sure sort of our attendees and listeners here should be aware of ARENA, but our Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and this is, I guess, the vehicle to help develop certain industries. And ARENA have now cast their focus to hydrogen as well recently. And they, I guess ARENA supports the funding of feasibility studies and helping the industry, or helping the development of hydrogen industry to progress through, and ultimately the same success as ARENA had with renewable energy and solar and wind in Australia, we're looking to replicate here when it comes to hydrogen. So at the moment there's a hydrogen round, and they've earmarked up to $70 million for a short list of projects, which I'll touch on later as well. And then I think there was also mention of obviously the various state initiatives. Queensland and South Australia obviously have clear initiatives. In Western Australia, we have a clear hydrogen strategy, and that was released last year in July in 2019. And the clear aspects to that strategy was to leverage the comparable advantages that Western Australia has in terms of our landmass, in terms of our wind and solar resource, and in terms of our export capability. As we do have an established export capability when it comes to sort of mining commodities and LNG and the associated funds that have been set up along with that hydrogen strategy. We certainly supported the National Hydrogen Strategy. So I think, Daniel, you mentioned your sort of input into the national strategy. We certainly contributed to that as well with bits and pieces. And then, you know, obviously when we look at our strategy and compare it to the rest of the world, there is, I guess, established strategies and sort of statements of intent globally, which makes sense for us to sort of appreciate that and leverage that and understand that. All right, now Australia's advantages, the land down under. I think when everybody sort of thinks about Australia, we sort of think, you know, sunny. We all go surfing, we go visit, you know, the tourist attractions and take pictures with kangaroos and koalas, and that's very true. But if we're going to sort of describe, I guess, our advantages, and if we look at it from a renewable energy perspective, I think this map, you know, sort of speaks to what, you know, what the advantages are. So we talk about our excellent solar resource and wind. You know, we've got different population densities compared to Japan, which is the image down there on the left, and different ones compared to South Korea, with a little image on the right. And I think Rachel touched on as well. These are our, you know, trading partners. If we're talking about regional hydrogen export, these are our, I guess, our trading partners that you know, that have been sort of engaged with, and you know, I guess various businesses and governments are talking, you know, to South Korean and Japanese businesses as well about that. As you can see, Western Australia is the largest state. There's lots of red sort of halfway up at the top, and that is the reason why we have, I guess, large projects like the Renewable Energy Hub being developed in the northern part of the state, you know, because it's got great solar and wind resource. If I talk about now, I guess, Western Australia, you know, we've got significant land available here. It is the largest state. Wind resource and solar. So we've got good data on it, and this is where we get involved with projects in, you know, developing ideas, and you know, obviously data is important to understand how much wind and solar is available in any particular location. This is getting better as we sort of measure it better now. And what I guess the interesting thing is the correlation between you know, wind and solar, and that's evident by some of the projects that we've seen around in the southwest corner of the state, where you have wind and solar farms being built together. The wind picks up the great resource during the day, and then the regular winds that we get in the afternoon, you know, gets picked up by you know, the wind farms. Our other comparative advantage here as well is that we have established export hubs. And what I mean by that, and on the map I've sort of specifically pointed out Port Hedland. Port Hedland's a major sort of port for the export of iron ore. And I know FMG was sort of mentioned in there. I mean, they have a large export capability out of Port Hedland for their product, as do other large mining companies who are operating in Western Australia. And this is seen as a, you know, I guess as an enabler. If we're talking about hydrogen export, and it is indeed seaborne export, you know, most likely, you know, Port Hedland would be, you know, a location for the export of green hydrogen. Not too different to Geraldton as well, and other parts of the state, in Kununurra as well. The project I'll touch on, but you know, on the back of hydrogen, green hydrogen from hydroelectricity, Kununurra could be a potential great location for that. Okay, so what I wanted to touch on here in terms of, I guess, green hydrogen, electricity, and I guess a sort of area that I've sort of been quite close to. All of these hydrogen developments need electricity and water as well. But when it comes to electricity, in the state of Western Australia, when we talk about on-grid electricity, we're really talking about the southwest corner of the state, and then a connected network around Port Hedland and Karratha. They're the two sort of grid areas, if I describe them that way. where you could potentially connect green hydrogen developments. The advantage to that is obviously you've got other sort of generation connected on those grids, so you can get 24-hour electricity. Although it's not fully green because you've got a lot of gas generation in the state. There are other benefits to that as well. Obviously, synchronous generation as opposed to relying on wind and solar, which may be non-synchronous. And the other distinction there, I guess, is off-grid electricity as well. And this is, I guess, if I go back to this slide here, everything else sort of, you drew a line halfway between that graph, across that image. Everything above that halfway line is, I guess, what we call the off-grid sector. This is sort of regional towns, mine sites, and the like. And at the moment, a lot of those are powered by diesel, or some by gas as well. But to create hydrogen projects in these off-grid areas, you're certainly offering an alternative to diesel generation, and obviously something that's got a lower sort of emissions footprint when we talk about hydrogen. And not just that as well, hydrogen can be used as a fuel for transport, and in particular, what I want to sort of point to there is the mining sector, where you've got mine trucks that are powered by diesel. There's lots of interest in, I guess, exploratory studies looking at powering these mine trucks via hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen. Okay, so project examples. Just at the time. So this is one, I guess, interesting one, and one that we've worked on very closely with BP and with ARENA. In that BP have been looking at a project just north of Perth, or close to the town of Geraldton and the port of Geraldton, looking at hydrogen export. This has been an interesting project because there is a large solar and wind resource associated with the production of this hydrogen. The Midwest of Western Australia is a great place if you want to build a wind or a solar farm. So that's naturally, I guess, why this project has to date, I guess, shown promise, for an export opportunity. Hydrogen export opportunity to offshore markets. There's a lot more information available, I think, on ARENA's website, but happy to field some questions about this later on. So that's one example, and I think the next one here as well, pumped hydro, using hydroelectricity to create hydrogen. This is a project that's being developed in the far north, and far northeast of the state. There is a 30 megawatt hydroelectric facility there, and that is built on Lake Argyle, which is a pretty picture of Lake Argyle. But Lake Argyle is a huge reservoir of water, significant lake. It is really big. I think some of the data that's been thrown around suggests it's 10 times the size of Sydney Harbour, for those people who live in Sydney or have been in Sydney. And there is certainly promise here again, looking at the power and the complementary water resource to create hydrogen. And I guess the sort of enabler here is that you've got existing infrastructure to be able to explore hydrogen development. Some of the value points there. Talked about those projects, the ARENA projects. I think Daniel had them in your slide, but I guess here are the sort of 7 shortlisted projects that are under assessment at the moment. And the distinction, and I guess the attention I'd like to draw here, is that 4 of them in Western Australia. And the likely reason why that is because of the great renewable energy resources we have. And also, sort of, I guess, favourable, policy settings here that will be supportive of further exploring, injection of hydrogen into pipelines, for example, or hydrogen in the context of, the mining sector as well. So those 7. I'm not quite sure when there'll be announcements made on those, but not wanting to breach commercial confidence, we certainly involved in 4 of those 7 projects, working closely with our clients. It's quite exciting to see, I guess, the opportunity and the sort of potential these projects present at the time. Okay. And looking, I guess in summary, and I guess what I wanted to sort of share here, and I guess our observations with these projects, with these clients, you know, having a presence on the ground and having opportunities to work on these projects is that, you know, if indeed, you know, we're going to see a hydrogen economy emerging, we've got to see costs come down. And you know, I guess our sort of indication suggests that, you know, up to 80% cost reduction, if it is going to be feasible long term. And I want to compare that to the little graphic on the side there. I guess if you look at, you know, sort of the cost, levelized cost and the increase of hub heights when it comes to wind, we'd be expecting to see a similar sort of downward trend when it comes to hydrogen. And as technologies mature, we get better at building these things. We get there's more efficiencies in technical efficiencies and process efficiencies and whatnot. We'd be expected to see cost reductions. The other challenges that we've observed as well are regulatory challenges, so things like technical specifications, standards, you know, regulatory perspective from safety, for example. I mean, if you talk to people about hydrogen, and first thing that comes is, you know, is it safe? You know, if someone wants to build a hydrogen facility next door to me, you know, is there a risk that may blow up? Things like this that are, you know, easily, I guess, addressable, and, you know, from technical people are quite comfortable in explaining it. But what I'm, you know, I guess trying to sort of outline there is that there are challenges there around, you know, standards and consistent standards and regulations that need to be adopted if we're going to see a hydrogen economy roll out across the country in a very consistent fashion. And lastly, community support. And I think, I guess, given the point I made to safety, the public perception is key to success. And working with these communities is also important. If we talk about the examples of potential hydrogen in, you know, remote regional areas, you know, reliable electricity supply in a small town, you know, I guess is important to you know, to that community. And I think giving them comfort that, you know, new technologies are not going to impact on the reliability of the electricity supply is important. So I guess the message here is engagement. Yep, so I mentioned before we work with the National Hydrogen Strategy. We'll respond to that. I think that was it for my slides. Yeah, in summary, significant global opportunity. Some of the slides that Rachel showed, I guess the things happening overseas is important. Significant commercial opportunity for us here in Australia and Western Australia. We've certainly got some material competitive advantages. We need to, I guess, you know, address the cost. So I think sort of, you know, organisations like ours are sort of, you know, play their part in the technical engineering and whatnot to drive those costs down. But also standards, regulatory and community issues need to be addressed. That's it I have. Yep, and that's it. Some links there, but that is it, Bella.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's been a really great presentation, and thank you for bringing it home also with those Australian specific projects that you've participated. There is something about Australia always starting these more risky projects, no? In the case of storage as well, you guys have quite large projects that, you know, other people around the world were trying to emulate, if you like. So it's good to see you guys starting there. You do have a really great renewable resource. So naturally, your renewable energy is always going to be that much cheaper. I have a few questions, guys. We don't have a lot of time because, you know, your presentations have been so great. We have about 5 minutes, but so one of the things that I want to ask is because every time, and I'm doing a lot of green hydrogen at the moment because it's like the new kid on the block and no one really knows, you know, we're all trying to find out how much time and effort and energy and should we invest on this, you know, is there a role for us, you know, and people who are in this audience usually are looking for what is the role, the angle at which I can, you know, become a player in this field. So the way I see it is, very often when we talk about hydrogen, we say, okay, yeah, there is, you know, hydrogen, it can be renewable, you know, renewable green, you know, this is something to discuss another time. We have a little bit more time. What is the right nomenclature? However, it sounds like because it's so cross industry, you know, you can use it for transportation, for energy, excuse me. It seems like it's going to come and it's going to save us all. It's going to be that silver bullet, you know, we just do this with hydrogen and everything else follows. But actually, it doesn't produce energy. What it does is store it. It's really an energy vector. So in actual fact, in terms of renewables, what it's going to do is it's going to give us more consumption. You know, as a renewable developer, for example, I am going to have more possibilities of selling my know-how and my technology because there is more needed in order to create hydrogen. So here comes really the question: how will the viability of renewable energy be a problem, particularly in the Australian case? You know, because this is what we're discussing. There is not a lot of CSP, you know, concentrated solar power that is dispatchable. There is some countries that have a lot of hydro, like Latin America, you know, it could be the case from some places. But if you don't have a great hydro resource, how do you address this variability program? Because my guess is electrolyzers need 24/7 electricity. So who wants to take this question? And then we'll follow, you know. Do you want to start, Rachel? And then.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be quick to give Robert and Daniel an opportunity as well. You know, the answer is electrolyzers are projected to become really, really cheap, which means that they could run on, you know, or on a few hours during the year, not necessarily at 24/7, which today is, of course, an issue because they're expensive. They need to run a lot to be able to make their money back. But if the projections do materialize and we get to those really cheap electrolyzers, mostly from the big competition we're seeing from China and Europe, projections are you can get to a world where electrolyzers kind of help renewables in their variability, in that they suck the excess renewables when there's a lot of it, and they stop running when there's not much renewables. So I actually see the variability of renewables as a reason to invest in hydrogen to help, you know, equalize or at least smoothen out some of this variability.
Do you have a time frame on that? Like, do you think it's going to take 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, that's hard to say. It's a great question. It's hard to say. Depending on the optimism in the electrolyzer projections. If we take Bloomberg, for instance, Bloomberg has really optimistic projections. But again, based on the recent few months, there's reason to believe those could materialize. By 2030, according to Bloomberg, this is when you can start having quite low utilization rates and still be in the money.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert, you've unmuted yourself, so you're next.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, look, I agree, Rachel. I think costs need to come down. I think we all sort of alluded to that in our presentations. Costs need to come down. You know, in terms of addressing the reliability of renewables, intermittency along with hydrogen and making that sort of cost competitive, you know, I think you know that sort of further focus on you know, the engineering and the sort of technical, you know, supporting the technical or improving the technical maturity of those technologies is going to help. You made the point about CSP, Belen. I mean, absolutely, we don't have no large-scale utility CSP. We don't have dispatchable, you know, sort of CSP here in Australia. And, you know, if we see cost increases in Europe, Middle East, and, you know, the United States, sorry, cost decreases, you know, is that potentially, you know, going to be an answer to sort of help with that intermittency? I'd like to see it, certainly. But in the meantime, I guess this is somewhat a limitation, and you think about sort of complementary, or you know, putting hydrogen production next to complementary facility, which is, you know, a bit more sort of dispatchable.
Daniel, did you have anything to add? Or I have one more question, guys. Go on.
Yeah, essentially, I see hydrogen as like a solution. As economies move towards 100% renewable energy, there's a whole bunch of electricity that will be produced that won't be needed. So what do you do with all that power? And hydrogen is one of the options. And then what do you do with that hydrogen? That's kind of why we're looking at exports. In Australia in particular, we've got a small domestic market, just generally low population relative to other countries. So will we have much of a need for that hydrogen here? Probably not. We can produce some fertilizers and whatnot, but export's the key. So it will actually soak up the additional electricity that we're creating. Yeah, I think that's the point there.
And, you know, neither Australia nor Saudi Arabia nor Chile, actually, these are, I think, the main countries that you were saying, Rachel, that, you know, are like actually like betting a lot and going for large projects. You know, Saudi Arabia has announced a humongous program, the NEOM program. I have been working with the Chilean authorities very closely in this kind of webinars, and they're doing a lot as well. So Australia has this huge project, a lot of projects too. So obviously you guys are moving in the right direction to scale it up, to get the costs down. And I just, my last question, and I know we're out of time, but it's going to be really quick, really. This has been quite great seeing lately that we now have a COVID vaccine. This is amazing. Oh, we never thought we'd be able to in 1 year. This is so great. It's never happened before. How do we distribute it? Literally, we're now in the most difficult part of the chain, which is how do you get this to everyone? And I am a little afraid that this is going to be the same with this sort of thing, because it's actually harder to distribute than it seems. A couple of the questions that we had from the were also in this direction. How do you distribute this? So I don't know if you want to give a few words in terms of how this can be done quickly, cheaply, and actually in accordance to the plans that we have for this. For renewable hydrogen. So Daniel, do you want to start, since you already had your microphone still unmuted?
So I'd suggest starting with local economy first. So things where we need the hydrogen today, like in fertilizer production, for example, get it in the country, get the expertise, bring the price down, and then plug it into the really large projects like the Renewable Export Hub, CWP's project. Yeah.
Robert?
Yep, absolutely. I think if we focus sort of locally first, and using it to sort of improve our manufacturing, spoke about green steel. I think we sort of mature and enable it here, and then start thinking sort of a bit more aggressively, sort of beyond our borders. And if we're going to talk about a vaccine, Belen, I don't think anyone listening in Australia has any sort of rush. I mean, we're happy to take it, but we've had it good for 6 months here. There's other parts of the world that might need it first before we do.
No, Robert, I'm really envious, but surely you want to travel, right?
Yes, I do. Yes,
Go on,
I
Rachel.
do.
Yeah, quickly, completely agree. Start with the low-hanging fruit, the existing users, and then go for those applications that have no other alternatives, like long-distance trucking, aviation. Start investing in those, in demonstration projects. Past standards for the trucking sector. The technology will come. We have great experience already with hydrogen trucks. Set the standard, industry will follow, and of course, policy is crucial. Right, clear government signal. That's something we're interested in, which Australia is doing, Asian countries are doing, Europe's doing. This is absolutely crucial, which we don't have in the US. So policy, low-hanging fruits, and set standards where we're already at a mature enough place to push the industry to meet those standards with hydrogen and other clean techs.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to the three of you, Daniel, Rachel, Robert. It's been great actually learning from you. As of late, I'm learning a lot about renewable hydrogen because we want to do an event also on renewable hydrogen. So I'll be in touch with all of you because I think you'll be great additions also to the roster of speakers. I find it amazing. The first industrial revolution, it took about 200 years for all the countries to catch on. Then we've kind of been shaving, the time of every time there's an industrial revolution. And now it comes to the point where, and this is quite amazing, really, where there seems to be a trend, everyone is starting to, and everyone hatches on. I'm seeing already a lot of like the big players in Spain, in France, in Germany, in Chile, in Saudi Arabia going and saying, this is the next few things. And I think this is where you can really change the world in a relatively short amount of time, 30 years. So perhaps we're just in front of this great revolution. And I think information is key for all of us to make it at the same time because there is no planet B. So thank you very much to the three of you. And thank you very much for everyone in the audience. We will be sending you the presentations and the materials so that we can keep the conversation going. And we'll be in touch with you also to speak about this event, which I think is very, very important that we discuss, in the world stage, because there is no point really like doing the same work, many times over in different countries. So thank you very much and see you soon, guys. Bye.
Thank you all. Goodbye.